So hi guys, I'm Whitney. Welcome back to my channel. I have been wanting to do this video forever. I realize that it's a little bit selfish and puts a lot of pressure on a lot of audience members for me to say books in a day because we all have different reading speeds. And I didn't want to just come up with a list of books that I can read in a day and be like, oh yes, this 1,000-page book I read in a day, wink wink. So instead I wanted to come up with a little bit of a stronger criteria. I really want to make sure that you understand that reading is not a race. I don't want you to feel bad if it takes you longer than a day or longer than a sitting to read any of these books. All of them are worth the read. All of them are really good and fun, and read at your own pace. That being said, I got 4 criteria for you. The first one is that these books are not novellas. I already have a video on my top 10 sci-fi novellas. I even did a top 10 fantasy novellas if you lean that way. The next easy criteria is that I want only 1 book per author, which is actually really difficult. And then I wanted to come up with some kind of length criteria. Initially, my first instinct was to go to page numbers. However, I arbitrarily came up with a number of like 350 pages or less, hopefully more leaning towards the less. But what I started to discover is that there are a lot of different editions of different books that have different page numbers. And it seems to matter how big or small the page is, what kind of font the publisher picked, what kind of spacing they have, what kind of font size. I figured that we should add in an audiobook narrator time. This is because they are professional readers, right? And so if they can read a book in a specific length of time, then that should count towards our books you can read in a day. So I chose arbitrarily 8 hours because that's a typical work day, right? If they're right around 8 hours or less, then that is going to be a book that we consider on our criteria. And then the last criteria is that length isn't enough. I know. Why do I have to make this so complicated all the time? I was looking through a bunch of different books that I wanted to add for this list. Found a couple of books that I really wanted to read that I tried to use this video as an excuse to read. And I discovered that there are just some books that are short, but you can't read them in a day. It's because they cover an incredible philosophical themes, or they have such an obscure plot, or because they're so in-depth scientifically, or because it's so convoluted. There's lots and lots of different reasons why length alone is not a good enough criteria to read the book for just 1 day. One of the best examples of this, The Einstein Intersection by Samuel Delany. This is an author that I've wanted to read for a very long time, and I thought, hey, this would be a perfect excuse to read this novel. However, it was definitely a book that I had to continually go back, reread, go back, reread. And then there was a part of the book that I sort of gave up and just restarted the whole thing. So this book took me way longer than a day to read. And while it's still definitely worth your time and energy and effort to read, it's not a book that I would recommend for a single day. So I told you this really long story to explain to you that all of the books on this list have to have the added criteria of being a little bit more fast-paced or lighthearted or easy conceptually. The list is divided into 2. I have chosen to divide it by time, and that means that we have some vintage books and we have the modern books. So let's get into vintage books. The first one I have for you is a book that took me completely by surprise. It's a book called Little Fuzzy by H. Beam Piper. This is not one that I had heard prior to starting a booktube channel, and it was published in 1963. This book comes in at 143 pages and is 5 hours and 52 minutes long on audio. This book is essentially, at its soul, a first contact novel. It follows a team of colonists who go to a beautiful planet who has already been scanned for sentient life and found to have none. In the middle of trying to survive the beautiful forests and the gorgeous meadows, they have these small, fuzzy, indigent creatures who show up in their homes and begin displaying incredible capacity for understanding our technology. Through this whole process, all of these colonists have to face a couple of questions like what determines sentience and how could could we prove sentience, especially in a court of law? This book held up so well over time. I must say that it's stunning. This book could have been written last year. I really thought this was such a fun, lighthearted, feel-good story that really more people need to talk about. I really haven't heard a lot of people on BookTube discuss it, and if you haven't heard of it, you should definitely check it out. I also wanted to make sure that everyone knew that this is the beginning of a trilogy, so there are 3 books in this series. It's kind of hard to get a hold of some of the books in this series, but it's much easier to get a hold of the omnibus edition, which is called The Complete Fuzzy. And who doesn't want to own a book called The Complete Fuzzy? Just saying. The next book on our vintage list is called Caves of Steel by Isaac Asimov himself. This book was published in 1953, has 224 pages, and the audiobook is 7 hours and 43 minutes. So it definitely qualifies at least in terms of length. This story is the first in his very famous robot series. It introduces us to an earthbound detective named Elijah Bailey, who was assigned a murder case of a very prominent spacer scientist. And to help him solve this mystery, he is partnered with a spacer and a robot named Daniel Olivois. I could be saying that totally wrong, by the way. Throughout the course of their investigation, Daniel and Elijah are constantly at odds, and Elijah finds himself constantly having to face his own biases and prejudices against robots and against spacers. There's quite a lot of discussion in this novel about, can a robot be human, or is a robot only its programmed self? There's a lot of discussion in here about what makes a human a human. Now, you should know that this novel is very much dated, and it is a little bit hard to take on women in particular, because there are wives and they do play a part in this story. Even though Isaac Asimov dedicated this to his first wife, I believe, gotta say, it left a little bit to be had here. If that's not something that's gonna bother you, like, shockingly, it didn't really bother me. This was just a fun, good read that was a really cool start to a series that I hope has only room to improve. A couple of my friends did mention to me that I probably would have enjoyed this book a little bit more if I had already read the I, Robot short stories by Isaac Asimov, which is on my list of shame and I have yet to read. I thought that this book did great. I wasn't confused or anything like that, so if you haven't read it, don't let it stop you. I also got a hold of this beautiful copy, which is very retro Atom Punk. I really enjoy. I hope I can get some more copies of this series in this style. The next book, Trouble with Lichen by John Wyndham. This one was published in 1973. It comes in at 208 pages and is 7 hours and 6 minutes long on audiobook. This book is a really fun one. This is my very first John Wyndham story, and it follows Francis and Diana, who are 2 scientists who are researching another antibiotic. They come across a lichen that isn't a very good antibiotic, but does extend the life of humans. And how it does it and the science of it is kind of glossed over, which wasn't the part of the story that was the most important. The part that was the most important was, should this revolutionary scientific breakthrough be shared with the general public? And if it should, how do we do it without having everyone burn the world around them to try to get this lichen for themselves? It was a really interesting foray into Wyndham, I thought. Even though this is not one of his more famous books, I really was impressed with his strong female characters, and I really thought that this novel did an amazing job combining a couple of ideas that I wouldn't have put together. For example, the whole idea of the fountain of youth in a lichen with the complexity that women have trying to choose career versus family. Who would have put that together? John Wyndham did, and it worked awesome. So I gotta say, after finishing this novel, I am so excited to read more John Wyndham. Day of the Triffids is definitely on my TBR. You should definitely check it out, okay? This is my version of it. You can see again how short and small it is. Next we have Roadside Picnic by the Strugatsky brothers. This is a Russian translated novel in 1972. It's 193 pages and it's 7 hours and 8 minutes. And yes, Yes, you guys, I finally got to this book after talking about it for my last 2 videos and being yelled at a couple of different times by Matt from Bookpilled. So I am going to talk about it considerably more in other videos. This book follows Red, who is known as a stalker. In this world, aliens have already visited planet Earth. They did not make contact. Instead, they stayed a couple days, made a ruckus, and then left. The areas that they left a whole bunch of things that they left behind. Kind of like things that you would leave behind on a picnic, which is the title of the novel. We're left with these zones of alien technology, and these zones provide hazard to human health. There are many things about physics that we don't yet understand that apparently the aliens were so advanced that they do. So Red or other stalkers are required or choose to go into the zone to retrieve some of the things that the aliens left over, to bring it out of the zone so humans can study it and try to advance our technology and our understanding of the world. What's interesting about the zone is that it's written and it's so atmospheric. It's so ominous. There are so many things that don't make sense that it almost comes across like magic, because so much of the zone doesn't play into the physics that we know. There are little areas where gravity is like 100 times what it's supposed to be, and it just flattens whole buildings or cars, and it happens suddenly and randomly. That's not something that we know anything about, and yet these men go into this field where there's something called hell slime, and there's all of these strange areas and creatures and things that got left behind that don't make sense. Shadows get inverted, our bones disappear. It's very a treacherous entry point into the zone. By far and away, the novel's biggest highlights were the scenes that take place inside the zone. However, this book follows Red and his stalker companions as they travel in and out of the zone, and they also get in all kinds of political trouble trying to prevent them from going into the zone and leaving it to scientists only. And of course, that doesn't work out very well. The novel is spanned over many, many years, and it's short and it holds up really well, and I would strongly suggest that you pick this book up. It was really thought-provoking and particularly interesting, although I do have to say I think that there were a couple of things that were lost in translation in this novel. You'll see what I mean. Bringing it back to the lighthearted things, let's talk about the next book called Goblin Reservation by Clifford Simak. This is again a less well-known novel by a well-known author. I think he's most notable for City and Way Station. This book was published in 1969, is 193 pages, and it's 6 hours and 15 minutes on audiobook. This book takes place in a world where humans are already intergalactic. There's many planets that have already been settled and colonized, and we have already reached out and met many of the alien species in our universe. Most of these alien species we already know about because they are goblins and trolls and fairies and all of the creatures of ancient lore, which were the alien races that have contacted us. And now we are in way better communication than we were in old times. We also have a better understanding of their technology. So in this novel, we're following Professor Peter Maxwell, who decided to take an interplanetary mission before the book starts to go research dragons, which no race has seen, but every race has legends over. Upon returning from this mission, he discovers that there is a doppelganger of his that was killed. And this copy of himself that was killed for some knowledge that he allegedly has. And so he decides to go into a little bit of investigation and find out what is it exactly that he knows that his doppelganger didn't, and what is he going to do with this information. This novel was very much lighthearted, way more so I've seen than his other novels, City and Way Station, but it was still hardcore Simak. He just has such a way with words. He's very straightforward, but a little bit more crafty than Asimov, and I really, really enjoyed this novel. I know that a lot of people told me it's not a great introduction to Simak because all of his other work is a little bit different, a lot more philosophical than this one, but if you want something that's just a fun, lighthearted science fantasy, this is your book. I would highly recommend that you check out The Goblin Reservation. Next, we have Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke. I know I've talked about this book before, but I had such a hard time leaving it off this list. I don't know, man. This book is 240 pages and is 7 hours and 43 minutes on audiobook. This is my version, in case you're curious or interested. To set the scene, we have the space race in between the United States and Russia. And right as they're about to launch all of the rockets into space, we find that alien contact has happened. The aliens arrive and descend on the planet everywhere in the world. And they contact us and they tell us that they are good aliens, but they don't want to meet us face to face for a variety of reasons. And throughout the novel, these aliens take on a very parental role to humanity as a whole. There is so much discussion in this novel about what humans need for success, what we're behind and immature in, and what we're good at. I really can't talk a whole lot more about this novel without spoiling it incredibly, but there are so many discussions to be had. I will warn you that there are several pieces of this novel that don't hold up well over time, but if you don't mind skipping through some of that or just having a little bit of patience, this novel has so much to discuss. I just can't put it any other way. I would also tell you that the ending is rather controversial, so that's always fun to have a discussion on. And this is a book that I love and have so many thoughts on. I might do a dedicated video on it at some future point. And finally, the last book on our vintage column is one that I almost didn't include because it's not quite as lighthearted as everything else was on this list, but I just have to include it. I just have to. I'm so sorry. Downward to the Earth by Robert Silverberg. This book was published in 1971 and is 176 pages, comes in at 7 hours and 9 minutes. This book is one that I picked up on the recommendation of a friend, but I had such low expectations. This book is, I guess, admittedly by Silverberg, a book that was inspired by Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad and has many, many parallels to that novel. We follow a gentleman who is returning to this planet, and he's been gone for about 8 years, and he used to govern the planet. Back when humans decided to take over the planet held quite a few elephant-like sentient aliens that had technology and culture that we didn't understand. And these creatures were not treated very well under human rule. It was with much chagrin that humans finally admitted that these creatures were sentient and that they weren't slaves. And so they freed this city and they freed the people. And the man is returning to sort of make amends for what happened under his rule and the things that he did poorly to these alien species. Throughout the entire book, the character goes through sort of a mental journey and has to face a lot of the biases and prejudices that he's built up over time and has to really start to recognize that his understanding of the world was poor and wrong. This book has so many anti-colonization themes and felt a little bit like the alien species were sort of like Native American Indians, kind of. And I highly recommend this book. I did a very, very bad job explaining the summary of this book, and in my defense, I wasn't excited to pick it up because the summary at the back of the book was also one that wasn't very good, and that's why I wasn't excited to pick it up, but it will surprise you. And if you're interested in a Robert Silverberg book, I highly recommend this one. I will also let you know that I loved it so much that I also bought the graphic novel of this book. We get to move on to modern books. Yay! The first modern book, Halfway Home by Hugh Howey. So this book was written in 2010, comes in at 228 pages, and is a 6 hour and 10-minute audiobook. And yeah, it does seem like I'm kind of doing the offhanded books of all of the big famous authors. This book takes place, at least at the beginning, of a group of colonists who are going towards a particular planet to colonize. And so they are growing up in cybersleep and they're being virtually trained. They don't leave their pods at all. The main character wakes up in a 15-year-old body that has never actually been inside reality outside of cryosleep, to loud alarms and the pod being on fire. There's a lot of sensory overload in this book. This poor kid has to get out of his pod and try to escape the fire that is burning all of the colonists. A small group of teenage colonists escape the fire, but they're left to try to live on an almost uninhabitable world full of all kinds of dangers, with not enough supplies and only the ship's AI to guide them because they're not completely trained, right? In this novel, we have a lot of fun, action-packed scenes. We also have have a traitor amongst our myths, and there's a lot of really interesting questions about AI and human interaction. This book was not going to necessarily blow your mind, but is very fast-paced, super fun, almost reads in between like YA and adult. And look at this beautiful, beautiful cover, huh? Next on the list is a book that I might have cheated to put on here, Dogs of War by Adrian Tchaikovsky. So I had to find a way to put Tchaikovsky on this list somehow, you know, right? This book was actually the book that gave me the idea for this video. So it was published in 2017 and it's 346 pages. However, there is no audiobook. Now I have looked into this and found out that Audible does plan on coming out with an audio version of Dogs of War sometime this year. Being that I don't know what the audiobook is going to come in at, I don't know how long it's going to be. So be well aware of that. I will show you, this is my version of it, and you can also see how thick it is. Oh, sorry, I read quite a bit of it. This book was just a really fun time, and I easily skipped life events to try to finish the book. I thought it was very well paced and it was very fun. It was lighthearted. It was awesome. In this book, we follow two points of view. The first is a genetically engineered super soldier who also happens to be a dog named Rex. And Rex is doing all kinds of war atrocities, but all he wants to be is a good dog for his master. Then we follow the second point of view, which are the humans who are responsible for Rex's creation and training. And of course, there is quite a lot of contrast between the two of their view of events and what's happening. Throughout the book, we get to see Rex's transformation and maturity into understanding what the decisions and what his actions and consequences are for the things that he is being made to do. This book was really clever and really fun, and again is totally different than Tchaikovsky's other works, but was so good, you guys. It was so good. I think that it was a little bit more superficial than I wanted it to be, because you really could make a lot more statements about genetic engineering and whether or not you should, but I still think that this book is a book that I would give to a teenager, and for adults, because it is an adult book, I do think that this is a book that you would enjoy to read in a single sitting. So if you're interested in getting into Tchaikovsky, but you don't want to read a long series, this would be the book that I would recommend to you. Next is another famous author, Peter Watts, and his Freeze Frame Revolution. This is a less well-known novel by him. You can see how short it is. It was an old library book. Sorry about that. Don't worry, I paid for it at the library sale. I didn't steal a book. Freeze Frame Revolution is 186 pages. The audiobook is 5 hours and 8 minutes. This book, it takes place on a generation ship. These people are on the generation ship essentially for life, and their mission in life is to create wormholes, the beginning of one and the end of one, throughout the universe, so that way humanity can use them to travel interstellarly. However, as you can imagine, if they're going from place to place, there's a huge amount of time in between. So they have to go into cryo sleep with time in between. And sometimes it's eons of time. 16,000 years, 120 million years. You never know how long it takes. And so these people have just these couple of snippets of weeks out of their life where they're supposed to build the gate and then they go back to sleep. And throughout time, they start to realize that humanity has forgotten about them, and they yet aren't able to stop because the AI is controlling them. And so they decide that they're going to throw a revolution against the AI, but they're dependent on it to go to sleep or not. So this book follows one particular character named Sunday in her realization and revelation, and later on her revolution against the AI. What's really great about this book is that it has everything that Peter Watts is typical for. He really makes you question what is humanity. And he also has some cool interactions between AI and humans that he makes you think a lot more about. He also has the ending that comes out of left field that is very typical for him. And he has, and I don't think this is a spoiler, but he has some awesome Easter eggs inside this book that you will miss if you have only listened to the audiobook. You have to have the textbook or the Kindle to actually get the Easter egg, and I would highly recommend that you try to figure it out. It was a super fun thing, and I respect him so much for having something along that line in this book. It made it just that much better, if you know what I'm saying. If you need a good book that's going to challenge your brain, but isn't going to be as deep or as thick as something like Blind Sight, this is the book for you. The next book is The Free Lunch by Spider Robinson. This book was published in 2002. The page number is 256, and it's 7 hours and 5 minutes. This was one that I listened to on audiobook, so I don't have a physical copy of it, but the cover is so beautiful. This book is very much very lighthearted and a very whimsical adventure. This book is straightforwardly a love letter from Spider Robinson to Heinlein, and it has that feel of the Heinlein juveniles. So if you were a huge fan of the juveniles that he wrote, you should consider reading The Free Lunch. So in this book, we follow a 12-year-old boy who has decided that he is tired of life and that he is going to run away and join the VR circus, and that is called Dreamland. It is a big theme park where everyone is happy.
Happy.
He meets up there with a bunch of other people who have done the same thing, is kind of like living there illegally. And with his other newfound friends, he ends up in the middle of a plot, an invasion to sort of ruin and take over Dreamland. And so he has to go out of his way to try to save Dreamland when all of a sudden there's some pretty significant sci-fi elements introduced. And one of the elements that is not a spoiler is the title, that there is a group of people who are trying to give humanity a free lunch. He really plays with this idea and tries to explore how exactly humanity could get a free lunch, without any extra strings attached. This book is, again, very whimsical. It was very fun. However, it did drag for me in the middle. It has a great intro and it has a really good end, but there is some slog in the middle. So be prepared for that if you pick up this novel. It is by no means a total negative and is still worth it in the end. And finally, last on this list, I had to include one of the most obviously left out authors on the list, and that is going to be John Scalzi. So there are so many books that I could recommend of his in this space, but the book that I decided to include is going to be The Kaiju Preservation Society, because I have recency bias and I just read it. The Kaiju Preservation Society was published last year in 2022, I think, and it's 258 pages and it's 8 hours and 2 minutes, so I still counted under the 8 hours. This one was very much tongue-in-cheek and lighthearted and doesn't really have a whole lot of deeper themes, but sometimes that's what you need when you just want to read a book in a day, right? So in this book, we're following a professor who gets recruited to go into a multi-dimensional world and take care of these big kaiju creatures, which are these large Godzilla-type monsters. And they have a huge impact on interdimensional space. And so you can't imagine what's going to go wrong there, right? So this one was just a fun monster with space involved adventure. I thought that it was a fun, whatever, good time read. And if you're interested in some of his other works that would fit here, there's also Agent to the Stars, which would definitely go here, or his version of Little Fuzzies that I haven't read yet, called Fuzzy Nation. I've heard that it's funny. The people who are in charge of H. Beam Piper's estate approved him to write this one. If you're into that story, but you'd like it to be a little bit more modern, maybe Scalzi is your guy. All of these are under that 8-minute or 8-hour mark for audiobooks, and all of them are short. All of them are supposed to be very wonderful, pleasant reads, and I just had to include them on this list. So you guys, that does it for the 13 books of science fiction that you can read in a day. Or so. No pressure, right? If you liked this list or if I missed something big, please let me know in the comments down below. Until next time.